everyone, this is Ashmita from Sources Classes. As you can see over here, I have written it down. This is from the General Studies paper of 2022, yes, from this year, and it is from the IES and ISS General Studies portion. And we are focusing on question number 2B in today's class. In each of my classes, I would be solving for you only one question, because you need to focus completely on one question in each class, and hence you can learn it more properly. And if you follow our channel, you will get all the answers to the questions provided over here. Now, people who have given this examination, you must be having the question paper, so you can follow it from there also. Otherwise, just read the question from here and I would be telling you what you could have written. Now we are focusing on 2B today. So it says, how does conservation of biodiversity, especially in the humid tropics, assure sustenance of livelihood of the people below the poverty line? So here they are firstly talking about the conservation of biodiversity, like including flora and fauna, which means in the humid tropics, okay, like hot and wet climate in the humid tropics, assure sustenance of livelihood of the poor people below the poverty line. So how is biodiversity conservation and poverty line people, like people below the poverty line, are relating to each other? What's the relation between conservation of biodiversity and people of like people below the poverty line? Let's discuss the answer. Let's focus on question number 2. Yes, question number 2B. Now, the rural poor often depend on biodiversity for a wide range of natural resources and ecosystem services, which are essential for their well-being, okay, and are therefore potentially affected by its degradation. So over here, you need to talk about how these rural people are dependent on biodiversity, like on the flora and the fauna. Again, and how they are getting affected by the flora and the fauna's degradation. Okay, about how they are facing problem due to the harm that is being provided to the biodiversity. All right. Against this backdrop, conservationists, development practitioners, and policymakers often have differing opinions on how and whether to link biodiversity conservation with poverty reduction. So they are actually linking, like in the question itself, they have told you that you have to link biodiversity conservation with poverty reduction. Nonetheless, the growing volume of literature on the subject often results in platitudes that fail to confront the real problems faced by development projects, plans, and policies. Indeed, the linkages between biodiversity and poverty are much more complex and dynamic than often assumed. Okay, so let's get to know what let's see what you could have written when you were discussing about the opinion regarding poverty reduction and biodiversity conservation. Achieving poverty alleviation through biodiversity conservation. Now, there is a risk of dramatic biodiversity loss and accompanying degradation of a broad range of ecosystem services. So, you see, one is dependent on the other, right? On this planet, each and everything is dependent on the other. No one over here is independent. So over here on biodiversity, these poor people depend. And after that, each element of our ecosystem depends on them. So like that, the circle goes on. So if biodiversity is affected, not only will uh, poor people get affected, also the rich people will also get affected, or normal middle class people will also get affected. So it's like in a circle going on. If the earth system is pushed beyond certain thresholds or tipping points, then of course there would be a problem. The loss of such services is likely to affect poor people the most, as they are highly dependent on ecosystem services. For example, yes, like the poor people are mostly dependent on ecosystem services. Like they have, like you can include examples like deforestation and forest degradation will increase the natural disasters such as floods and landslides, cause the depletion of drinking water, or it can also lead to water contamination. And it will decrease the available food, then traditional medicines and sources of energy. Available food, traditional medicines, and sources of energy. On all these, the poor people depend on biodiversity. And the loss of biodiversity could also lower the agricultural production levels, like induce the spread of infections and reduce the adaptability to climate change. So all these are the wrong bad effects of losing biodiversity. Any of these scenarios as some concern will affect the poor most directly. So once again, we are coming back to our main discussion, that is how biodiversity conservation is affecting the poor. So any change in either the agricultural production levels, in either the spread of any kind of scenario, or any kind of adaptability to climatic change, or any concern regarding food, all these will actually directly affect the poor most directly, bringing about a vicious cycle where they are driven into even further poverty. So that will create the loss of biodiversity, will create a much more vicious cycle, like it's a really a sad cycle, a wrong cycle, which will actually take the poor people further into poverty. Okay, cooperation. Cooperation must be carried out in such a manner that its benefits unfailingly reach the socially economically disadvantaged. So cooperation should be carried out in such a way so that it benefits economically backward people. Poverty alleviation and biodiversity conservation are both fundamental to the policy agendas of post-colonial states, even if they do not enjoy similar levels of commitment. Now they have given example, you can include this example or you don't have to. The continued legitimacy of the developmental state rests on its willingness and ability to address poverty. Now this legitimacy of the development state actually rests on their willingness and ability to address the poverty. Okay, modern states have also created multiple agencies to conserve the natural resource environmentalists, such as forests, national parks, and water bodies where biodiversity exists. Indeed, it is not just states that attempt to conserve the biodiversity and alleviate the poverty. Large numbers of non-governmental organizations operating at the various levels of socio-spatial aggregation also consider one or both of these goals as primary reasons for their existence. Next thing that we are going to discuss is how biodiversity matters to development. So just because we can understand how biodiversity is affecting the below poverty line people, it means that it matters to development also. So biodiversity underpins the ecosystem goods, that is, for example, food and fuel, and services like climate regulation, water supply, etc., upon which society depends. Okay, so on every stuff, that is for food, for fuel, for climate regulation, for water supply, for any kind of services, The entire society actually depends upon biodiversity. That is both on ecosystem goods, both on flora, both on fauna. The next thing that we are going to talk about is poor people who are most directly dependent on these goods and services because they get these things very quickly, very easily, very directly, and therefore are most affected by the loss of biodiversity. So, more the harm we do to biodiversity, the more affected would be these poor people. So, with by harming one thing, we are actually harming all of them. Biodiversity loss undermines the food security, nutrition, and health of the rural poor and increases their vulnerability to external shocks. A vulnerability to external shocks. Biological resources like timber, fisheries, productive land make up a large proportion of the wealth of the developing countries and are a comparative advantage on which economic development can be built. So, when biodiversity actually helps in the growth and development of a country, when we affect that biodiversity, definitely it will lead to poverty. And poor people who are directly like dependent on biodiversity, they will get directly affected by it because as middle class people or as rich people, they mostly depend on the processed things. So directly they won't be affected by biodiversity if there is affect if there is hamper of biodiversity, but the grassroots root level people, they are directly concerned with biodiversity. They are mostly dependent on goods and services that come directly from the ecosystem. So they will be the first people who will be affected with the hamper of biodiversity. Yeah, so that was the answer, like the outline of the answer that you could have written in a bit detailed way in your answer for this question. We are going to continue with this other questions from this question paper again in the next series of videos. I would be solving each question in each video, so you can just follow our channel for getting all the answers. That's it for today's class. If you want to post your queries, you can just post it down below in the comment box. Or if you want to join our classes for any kind of exam preparation that you are aiming for or you are like aspiring for giving, then you can just like enroll in our classes and get the benefit of live lectures, recorded lectures, doubt clearing sessions, crash course facilities, scholarship facilities, mock test facilities, solutions to the previous year's papers, and so on and so forth. So that's it for today's class. We're going to meet once again in our next classes.